Welcome back to the Radio Academy podcast. I'm your host, Georgy Jameson, and this week, my guest is producer Vicky Wright from Crowd Network. The first couple of episodes of the second series of their podcast collaboration with Greenpeace, Oceans Life Underwater, is out this week. And Vicky went to the Arctic with presenter Hannah Stitfall to record. I wanted to find out about the challenges you face when recording in such a remote and unusual location. But first, I asked Vicky to tell me a bit more about the podcast.
Oceans Life Underwater is a co-production between Crowd Network and the Greenpeace Oceans team, where we delve into all the really weird and wonderful creatures that live under the seas, basically. And in Series 2, we've been exploring a little bit more of the threats that they face. So Series 1 was very much look at all these wonderful things under the ocean. And we still do that in Series 2, but we also kind of address some of the threats that these creatures are currently facing as well, and the impact that that has on like the communities that depend on the oceans, and just kind of how we're all interconnected via the water.
Now, this series took you and the team and host Hannah Stitfall to the Arctic. That must have been amazing, but cold.
Yeah. Well, so weirdly, not cold enough, which was like, yeah, it's quite jarring because obviously you hear all about your planet's getting warmer, etc., etc. And genuinely, like, we arrived and me and Hannah were both just like, it's not very icy here. It's not that cold. Like, it was in the summer as well. So the Arctic does have seasons, much like, you know, other countries, but they are normally a lot more like defined and obviously a lot colder. And it wasn't that cold. I'd say, you know, we were in like long sleeve top and a coat. It wasn't layers upon layers.
You didn't have to have thermals and things.
No. So we spent a bit of time on Svalbard, so like an island in between Norway and the North Pole. All there didn't need thermals at all. And then we did spend 24 hours on one of the Greenpeace ships, kind of following one of their campaigns. Then you needed thermals. Right. It was cold on the deck there. So the ship went out to a glacier, and then we kind of looked at the glacier, and Greenpeace did an entire campaign and project. Me and Hannah just stayed on the boat and watched them from afar. That was when it got chilly, was out on the deck at 2 a.m. Then it was like -10. So then you needed your thermals.
Tell me about your role in the team. What did you have to do for this podcast series?
Weirdly, I started out the project as a digital producer. So just making social content, you know, nice videos for the social media channels, and then just kind of helping a bit with the production. And then it turned out we needed someone to go to the Arctic. The producer that was working on it was like, I can't go. She had a wedding for another podcast that she was working on. So she was like, I can't go. Can you go? I was like, it is next week. Like, but sure, let's make it work. I'll go to the Arctic in a week's time. After that trip, I then became the producer on it. So I've produced all of the episodes now. There's 12 episodes in total. There's 2 out at the minute. And I've kind of produced all of them along with a researcher and another assistant producer. Kind of the role when I was at the Arctic was basically just follow Hannah around, make sure that we talked to all the right people, get us all set up. I had to take all the kit with me. So that was basically like my luggage was just podcast equipment kit and a few coats. Like, that was pretty much it. Which really it gets weirdly searched at airport security, which is obviously good. They should definitely search it. But they are like, what's this? I'm like, well, that's a microphone. Like, why do you need one of these? It's like, right, it's a long story, but we're recording a podcast. Yeah, so I just kind of had to live with Hannah for a bit. Like, we just became like a little duo, kind of went around, did a bunch of interviews with different people who were working on the ship, and then a bunch of people who kind of live in the Arctic as well. Obviously, we kind of explored the local communities and what kind of people live there. And we conducted all of those interviews. So it's just kind of the real go-between between our researcher back in the UK, Hannah, our presenter, and then me.
This is quite an unusual place to go and record. It's a pretty remote location. It's not your everyday recording location for a podcast. So what were the challenges and problems that you face when you're recording somewhere remote like that?
So I think that initially what I thought were going to be the problems was like, you know, how do you keep a microphone safe in a snowstorm? That was kind of what I went into it expecting. But actually, it ended up being so much different. Like, a lot of the a lot of the problems that there ended up being, there was nothing like technical at all. It was literally like, we're living on a boat. You have to really live by the hierarchy that's on the boat, obviously for everyone's safety, but also as like a respect thing as well. Like, it's just important that everyone follows, everything is captain's orders, and then everything really peters down. And we were absolute bottom of the list. Obviously, we didn't have authority at all, as we shouldn't. Don't put me and Hannah on a boat and give us authority. That's not wise. We're not seafarers. Kind of that ended up, I think, being a bit more of the challenge, which was that we were following one of Greenpeace's like massive campaigns on that ship. And you kind of didn't want to get in people's way. Like, we were there to obviously record it and document it. But I think the nature of a podcast is very much like you sit down and you talk for a lot longer. I actually think it would have been easier if we were filming it, because then you can just, film people doing what they're doing. But actually, we need to sit down and have people's real like undivided attention for like 40 minutes, and just getting that time from people was quite difficult. And also kind of making sure that they trusted us. Like, whilst we know that we're working on this production alongside Greenpeace, when you think about how big of an organisation Greenpeace is, then you're getting different people from all over the world who are Greenpeace campaigners coming onto this boat. They don't know us. We're expecting them to trust us with their stories about, something that really means the absolute world to them. And we're having to make that relationship in 20 minutes with them in order for them to like tell us everything. So I think that ended up kind of being something that was a bit more challenging. And then also just, trying to avoid seasickness. That was quite a lot as well, because we were told that we might get seasick. Thankfully, we didn't. But I think the fear actually made us quite ill. Just the fear of us, we were like, oh my God, we're going to be so ill. We're going to be so ill. We weren't. We were absolutely fine. But, that does feel like one of the things that we thought was going to be a massive issue. And then on top of that as well, one of the other challenges was I hadn't met Hannah until we arrived at the Arctic together.
Right, okay.
So I didn't work on series 1. That was one of my amazing colleagues, Anna, who no longer works for Crowd Network. And so it was like, oh, Vicky, by the way, you're going to the Arctic next week. Also, you've never met the presenter. Hope that's okay. Hope you get on. And so I think that's quite a challenge as well, is to not only meet someone for the first time and then have to come up with a really great series, but actually to meet someone and then be literally living with them. Like, we shared an Airbnb, we shared a bunk bed on board, and just to kind of get that relationship going straight away. I think that's a challenge. Well, Hannah is lovely and we're so similar. So thankfully it was very easy and we got on great. But if we hadn't, that would have been fun. That would have been difficult. Yeah,
it would have been. It sounds like a baptism of fire, really.
Yeah.
I mean, Hannah, lots of people know her from The One Show, from Springwatch. So there you are. You're on the Greenpeace ship, Arctic Sunrise. Did you have to live on board for a while?
We were only on board for 24 hours, but we did have to, eat, sleep, go to the loo, live with people.
Well, people you didn't know well, that you had never met before.
No, not at all. So I'd never met any of the Greenpeace team in person before. I'd been on calls with a few of them. But then again, the Greenpeace team is so huge that actually, say if I'm on a call every week with, 8 people, they're not the 8 people that are on the ship. One of them was on the ship, the day before we were on. And then they came back to land. Then we switched over, because obviously there's limited space as well. Like, there's limited beds, there's limited literally physical space on the ship. So you're really limited in numbers. It was quite a struggle to even get me there. Initially, Hannah was just going to go. And then we were like, actually, we're not going to get much if Hannah goes on her own. While she's incredible and she has both presenting and production experience, you can't do that all by yourself.
No.
You need someone there with you.
And if she got sick...
Yeah, exactly.
She'd have got nothing.
No, not at all. Yeah, she'd have been screwed. But yeah, we were eating with everyone that's working on the campaigns alongside the captains. That's what's quite interesting. So there is a really clear hierarchy, but also in a really nice way. So at meals, you're sat next to the captain, who is, top dog.
Yeah.
But he'll eat his pasta with you. Of course he will, because that's just kind of the people that they are. It's really learning their culture straight away and being like, what's the culture on board this ship? And how do we fit into it and make sure that we can get the best content, but also represent the podcast well as well.
We are back with even more episodes of Ocean's Life Underwater. And I've got some very exciting news to share with you all. Since you last heard from me, I've been on my very own journey across the waves, travelling all the way to the Arctic itself.
It's a bit tricky because there are actually polar bears out there, so they need to have a polar guide with them, and just a certain amount of people are allowed to go on land. Today my job is doing a projection on a glacier.
A projection onto a glacier.
But it's not just the ice and cold we're exploring. We're swimming with dolphins, protecting the turtles, and meeting the people who are going to protect 30% of the oceans by 2030.
A huge school of dolphins came and were playing in the bow, and they were sparkling.
We've just discovered recently that sea turtles are actually fluorescent.
So there's always that possibility of something big and exciting, literally just out of arm's reach.
Tell me about the tone on the podcast, because you're working with Greenpeace. You're talking about big environmental issues. How do you make sure that the tone is entertaining and captures the audience without it being too heavy? Because it is a really serious subject.
Yeah, massively. So that's what we've really tried to achieve with the podcast, is that the podcast is an accessible way into Greenpeace for people. So it's not, here's all of these massive campaigns that we do against all of these really terrible things. That we've really tried to, with the podcast, paint the oceans in the absolute most beautiful way that we can. So we speak to people like free divers, we speak to sailors, we speak to people who live their lives on the ocean, and really try and capture that beauty of the oceans. Because as much as Greenpeace absolutely do want to campaign fists in the air, absolutely, like deep sea mining is one of the things that is in the series, but it's a really, really complicated process that your average person on the street, they don't understand. But actually your average person on the street does understand that a tiny squid that's this big and looks like a strawberry is so sweet and adorable. And actually then, once we've kind of built up this relationship between the listener and the ocean of look how wonderful these things are, then that's kind of when we approach and bring in a story from someone who has maybe had a bad time recently with something to do with the ocean. So that might be a scientist who's campaigning against deep sea mining. One of our best guests, I think, this series is an ex-shark fisherman. He now works for a conservation charity as a photographer, and basically kind of counts what he can see. He lives in Madagascar, so he counts what he can see in the Madagascar ocean and kind of reports back on that. And that's really important work for the charity. But he was a shark fisherman. So it's using people's stories. A lot of it, it's not just, here's loads of really intense facts about something really bad, because that's not relatable to anyone. And that also doesn't really fit with Greenpeace's mission either. They want as many people as possible to understand their stories and their arguments and why they do what they do. And they're not really going to get that just by shouting loud and telling people what they should do. And they really understand that as well. So they're really nice to work with, the way that we can go to them and we can say, we want to make a series that shows how beautiful the ocean is. And they say, yeah, of course, we trust you. Can we get our campaign message in? And we're like, yeah, of course you can, because it's your podcast too. And I think that's the real benefit of working as a co-production. It's technically a podcast where, they come to us and we make it for them. But actually, we really work together on it to make sure that it's a product that everyone's happy with. And they understand that our input as producers is almost as, if not just important as theirs, as an entire worldwide brand. And we're just a tiny company in Manchester. We don't have all of these hundreds of thousands of people who know who we are yet. Maybe they will do one day.
Something I noticed listening to some of the podcasts was the soundscaping is beautiful. How much of that do you think helps keep the tone light and gives the audience an immersive experience when they're listening?
Yeah, I think it's so important for people to, as well as be able to hear about the beauty of the oceans, to actually be able to hear the beauty of the oceans themselves as well. That is so, so important. I think what we've realised is not that many people really live near the water. If you talk about a coral reef, people can imagine in their head, I'm sure it's very colourful, etc. But no one really knows what that sounds like. But actually, when we get people who come on and they do live by the ocean and you ask them to explain what the ocean looks like where they are, they can explain it to you and it is what you're expecting. But then actually, if you ask them to explain how it sounds, you get such a different response from people. It's almost like a question that they haven't been asked before. And they get to explain in their minds, how a sense that they've never considered when they're underwater, which is really, really brilliant. One of our guests is in I think episode 5 or 6, she is South Africa's first blind scuba diver. And so she can't see the ocean, but she loves diving, and she loves diving because of how it sounds and how it feels. And so to have her be able to describe that sense to us, and then us be able to like recreate the sounds that she hears, I think is like so wonderful. And it's like, it really helps with that storytelling element as well that we have in it, where, you know, you're not just hearing someone talk about something, you're actually hearing that thing yourself.
The sound of the ocean is so evocative. I often go to sleep with wave sounds.
Mm-hmm.
It really helps me sleep. But like you say, when you think about looking at fish, sea life, coral reefs, it's a visual, colourful thing. So to capture those sounds, it really made me feel like I was by the sea or in the sea.
And it sounds different everywhere as well. I think it's like one thing that we've learned, that, you know, the sea off the coast of Ireland, where a surfer who we spoke to was describing, that sounds so different to how one of our guests who was based in Mexico describes the sea. It's like, it's so interesting just the difference in those two as well.
Last year, I had the incredible opportunity to travel to Svalbard, an archipelago located halfway between the north coast of Norway and the North Pole. I joined the Greenpeace team aboard the Arctic Sunrise as it set sail on a journey across the ocean. During my time there, I had the privilege of speaking with the crew and learning about the groundbreaking work they're doing to protect this fragile region. Laura Meller, Greenpeace's Nordic Polar Advisor and the global project lead for their Oceans campaign, was one of the first people I spoke to on board.
I have a very vivid memory of standing on the bridge wing and looking outside, and there was this incredible soft light and a moon bow above the ice floes, and I felt this urge it was like, if I just breathe into my mouth and then I close it, will I be able to capture some of this so that I can bring it back home and show to others? Like, what are the ways that I can preserve this experience and have this very physical memory of just how amazing place it is?
Going back to that remote location, going back to the Arctic, if you had to do it again, or you were sent to another really crazy remote location, what would you do differently next time?
Oh, that's a good question. I think, like, personally, I wish I'd have gone into it more confident. I wish I'd have gone into it not thinking this is just another record, but I wish I'd have gone into it thinking like a listener, because it was such a quick turnaround. I think I literally found out like the Wednesday before that I was going, and then the next Tuesday I was in Oslo. Like, there wasn't much time to really think about things. And I wish that I'd thought a little bit more, like, you know, kind of not being afraid to ask really stupid questions, because actually that's what the listener thinks. Like, you know, I represent a listener quite well to the show. I know a bit about Greenpeace. You know, I support their mission. I'm not across what they're doing 24/7. And so I kind of wish I'd gone to the Arctic a little bit more like that, a little bit more like willing to ask the really stupid stuff rather than just, you know, sit up at night trying to work it out myself. Because actually they can give you their response more, and they have the lived experience of it. And everyone was so lovely as well that they absolutely would have been so nice and explained everything. Yeah, and like just not been like as scared. I spent so much time scared that we were going to get eaten by a polar bear, and we weren't. And it turns out that there's not, like, you're not actually that at risk of being eaten by a polar bear. But when you Google these things, which is what I've been doing, you learn that I think you can only access 10% of the island. Well, it's an archipelago, so it's like a group of islands.
Yeah.
But you can only access 10% of it. You cannot go past certain barriers because that's where polar bears live. And so you read that and you're like, well, obviously I'm going to get eaten by a polar bear. If I'd have spent less time worrying about that, then I think I could have spent more time worrying about actual stuff that mattered.
I wanted to ask you as well about the projection onto the iceberg.
While we were on the ship, what we were doing there was following kind of a day in the life of a Greenpeace campaign. And this one that they were doing was an anti-deep sea mining campaign. And they had filmed messages from people all over the world telling the Norwegian government why they didn't want them to allow mining to happen in their waters. And I basically hassled the guy that was doing the projection all day and was like, is there any chance, you know, in your projector, can we give you our podcast image? Can you put that on the glacier as well and take a picture? And he was like, yeah, sure. And when you're like, yeah, but is he just saying that to, make me happy? Constantly, I was like, right, have you definitely got the picture? Have you definitely got it? Are you sure you've got it? Do you need anything else? And he was like, no, don't worry. So then it was like, I don't know, like 11 p.m. And in order to do a projection onto a glacier in the Arctic, there's only 2 hours of darkness every day at the time when we were there. Otherwise, it's light all the time.
Very rarely it doesn't really get dark, does it?
No, not at all. And the previous nights as well, it had got nowhere near dark enough for this projection to work. So, at 11 p.m, everyone's being lowered down onto the tiniest little dinghy boats that you've ever seen with this massive projector. It looked terrifying. Me and Hannah were just on board watching by this point. And then they all zoom out and you don't really know how far away you are from a glacier at any point, because there's no trees in Svalbard, and I think generally in the Arctic. So you've got no actual reference of how far away things are. So it just looked like they were going for ages and ages and ages, and just like they were being really slow. But actually, no, they were traveling really far away from where the main boat was stationed. And then, they took this projector, put it on land, and they projected all of these messages from around the world from all these people. And they filmed it in order to make a video to send to the Norwegian government. And then at the end, just as Lucas promised me he would do, and probably would have done without me having to hassle him 10 times. I think he only needed asking once. He projected our podcast artwork onto a glacier, and then they took some really cool photos of it as well. And so now, they are, I've sent them to you, and then they're also on our podcast socials as well, which is @OceansPod. So you should give that a follow too.
Well, that was what I was going to say. Where could people listen?
Yeah, OceansPod for any socials, and then just search Oceans Life Underwater, wherever you get your podcasts.
Vicky, it's been great. Thank you so much for being my guest. It's been lovely.
Thank you.
I'm glad you didn't get eaten by a polar bear.
Yeah, me too. Didn't even see one. Went all the way to the Arctic, didn't even see a polar bear.
A big thank you to Vicky Wright from Crowd Network for being my guest this week. You can find Oceans Life Underwater Series 1 and now Series 2 wherever you get your pods. Our Belfast Foot in the Door event is on the 19th of March at Queen's University Belfast. It's a day of training and connections with workshops and speed networking, followed by a social event in the evening. There's also lots of great guest speakers, so check out the website to book your place, radioacademy.org/training. Please like and subscribe to the Radio Academy podcast wherever you get your pods. And if you fancy leaving us a review, then it all really helps and we really appreciate it. Next week is the last of our Meet the Fellows series when I chat with the head of TalkSport, Liam Fisher. I'll see you next week.